Nice. All right, so today I got Terris Hightower. So the reason I get to connect with Terris is because of Adam Perry. Shout out to Adam. So
Shout out.
I was looking into like Bill Hartman stuff, and then all of a sudden Adam just called Terrace, and we just keep talking about this stuff, and I found like Terrace is like really smart, like really smart about his stuff. Probably one of the smartest people I ever talked to. So I decided to like invite Terrace on my podcast. He's currently the director of sport performance at Hoops Crew, and he used to be the head strength coach and assistant athletic trainer at Capital City Go-Go. And I know at one point you're also associate athletic trainer at Washington Wizard. So
Yes. Okay. All right. So yeah, my name's Terris Hightower. I am a foot and ankle specialist and a pathomechanist, currently consulting in the private sector right now with different NBA teams, but I'm also finishing up my doctorate this year in physical therapy right now at Elon University.
nice, nice. So I guess my first question is like, since you already was in the NBA, why do you leave and go to
Mm.
pursue like your doctoral physical therapy?
Great question. I would say primarily just having foresight. When I was in the NBA, I kind of noticed that number one, I really felt like I needed a more in depth foundation in movement sciences. I also liked the idea that the physical therapists were getting out with doctorate degrees, and I knew ultimately I would have my end goal of being in leadership, executive positions, consulting type of positions, entrepreneurial type of positions. And honestly, purely the doctorate degree itself, just having the doctorate kind of in front of your name was pretty much one of the driving factors, on top of the fact that I kind of saw and even was instructed to by some mentors in some high places that strength coaches are going to DPT strength coaches. Athletic trainers are going to more DPT ATCs. Um, and the hybrid practitioner is becoming more of the standard in the NBA. And so you're already starting to see that in a couple teams right now where entire strength coach staffs are pretty much all physical therapists as well.
Nice, nice. So uh I guess my question leading to that is like you mentioned, there's you're consulting with teams. You were at the NBA at one point. So what made you want to go to the NBA and like your journey to the NBA?
I guess just since I was a kid, I have always been into basketball. You know, I play basketball. I love basketball. I love the NBA, not just the game of basketball, but I love everything about the NBA. And it's always been one of my childhood you know just kind of dreams, just to be a part of somewhat or anything of the NBA. And as a hooper, that's something that once you kind of figure out that you're not going to play in the NBA, you kind of figure out, well, what can I do to get there? And I guess it started as becoming an athletic trainer, and then from there, I guess being, I don't know, confident or cocky enough to kind of think that I could get there. But things didn't really switch until I moved up to Northern Virginia, close to DC area, and I took a grad position at George Mason University as a graduate athletic trainer. And from there, I started to meet people in the DMV area, meet some sports scientists, and kind of. And I remember when I was in athletic training school in undergrad, I I knew I did not want to be like your typical athletic trainer, and so I was kind of already trying to I guess, rebrand myself as a strength coach, as a sports scientist. And that's why I went the route of going to grad school in this sports science program that they had at George Mason, because I wanted to kind of become like a biomechanist, be in sports science, be a strength and conditioning coach. And those are the opportunities I kind of started to seeking out. And I started seeking out strength and conditioning roles or internships and sports science positions in the area. And I found myself at University of Maryland, basketball internship for strength and conditioning. And I also found myself, which ended up being a lot more high yield. And I didn't think this would be the more high yield of the choices, but I found myself working at MedStar Performance or MedStar Medical. And there's just the medical or the healthcare system that is the big healthcare system that the major DC teams utilize for their healthcare needs. So it ended up being I guess, a entry point into getting or being around people that were close to the Wizards. And when I did both of those internships in the same day. And so from, I guess, in the summer, I would be at MedStar, and I'll be doing some strength and conditioning stuff, some sports science stuff, some force plate stuff, some return to play stuff in their rehab center. And that would be like from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. And then I would drive over to University of Maryland, and I would go from University of Maryland from like 3 to like 7. And I did that kind of every day in the entire summer. And by the end of or close to the end of the summer, an opportunity came up with the Wizards. And, they said, we were kind of looking for a young practitioner that does a little bit of athletic training, can do a little bit of strength and conditioning, can do a little bit of sports science. And the guy that was over me was like, I kind of know somebody that can kind of fill that role for you. And I kind of interviewed and kind of went from there.
Nice, nice, nice. So, um, I want to start by asking you questions about your LinkedIn post because I know you
Mm,
shared a lot like great posts. That's why I said like before we start recording, I said like this is I literally spent like hours preparing for this podcast because I have I didn't know enough knowledge about like the foot and ankle. I need to like read your article, read your
yeah.
ebook, which is all great stuff. So let's start with the one you did with the ankle mobilization one.
Okay.
And that was like really big hit, right?
Yeah, that was a good one. That was a
So
good
can
one.
you like kind of share like your thought process on like uh how did this thought came up
Mm.
and how like your approach to this mobilization skill? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and we talked about this a little bit, right? And I mean, that's just the big one. That's the big mobilization that everybody uses. That's the mobilization that, if you had to, poll any amount of strength coaches or athletic trainers, physical therapists, hey, what's your go-to mobilization for ankle mobility? It's going to be the posterior talar mobilization. And whether you're doing that manually with your hand or you're doing with a band pulling in the posterior direction, it is the most popular one. And so with me being somebody that kind of is, I guess, addicted to trying to post something on LinkedIn and it be really popular, I have to find something that everybody does and find an issue with it. And so that if I actually can find an issue with it, that's probably the reason why people engaged with it, will engage with it, and it will do well. And that was one of those posts that was kind of like the perfect storm of everything. And I guess it just came from me actually doing it so much. And to be honest, I just don't feel like it worked. I know that when I was in the NBA, that's what people told me to do. If you want some dorsey, and the buzzword for the foot and ankle, everybody is always talking about dorsiflexion, right? Ankle dorsiflexion. And so I was always thinking about ankle dorsiflexion. And, in the most simplistic or reductionist way, I would do the posterior talar mobilization. And of course, and I remember asking players, hey, is this better? And they'd be like, Yeah, it's a little bit better. And that never made me, I just didn't like that response. When I do something on the table, I want somebody to go, "Oh, that's 1,000% better," and I never would get that. And even if you talk to fellow practitioners, or even with my time in the NBA, we keep track of ankle dorsiflexion. We didn't make any improvements in ankle dorsiflexion year to year. And one of the key reasons that kind of, I guess, sparked this thought process of why doesn't it work, or does it work, or what's better, it really came down to something as simple as I didn't know the foot and ankle enough. And I didn't know the intricate movements of every single bone, muscle, ligament, joint in the foot, in the ankle, in the tibia, in the knee to to think about it. And it wasn't until I deep dived and I, spent, the last 2 to 3 years studying pretty much every single joint. No, I've have studied every single joint, every single muscle, ligament, and it's been really eye opening to find out just how much you won't learn in PT school, just how much you won't learn in your sports science master's kines program, you won't learn in your athletic training program. There's so much about the entire body, not just the foot and ankle, that you're just not going to learn. And as I started to learn more about how closed chain biomechanics occur, some of the coupling mechanics of different joints. I started to learn about joints I didn't even know existed. And when all of that kind of came into play, I had enough foundational knowledge to ask better questions. And then once I asked better questions, that's kind of how I started to, I guess, figure out or investigate how we got to where we were. And that's kind of how that LinkedIn post came about. And the results were just it was amazing. And it was kind of one of those first posts that really put, I guess, eyes on me. And, I had some very respected people in the profession, agree and add their own context. And I've even had, that was actually the conduit of how I actually had my first consultant, my first paid consultant gig actually happened, where somebody from the NBA team, they read that post and then they reached out to me. And it kind of, to kind of paraphrase, they were like, "Hey, man, I love that you're challenging that because we do that all the time. What else do you got?" And, things kind of went from there.
Cool. So talk to me about this, your thoughts on this ankle mobilization. So
Mm-hmm.
since like yeah, it doesn't work. Like last year when I work with basketball athletes, they do it all the time every year, and the athlete was like, I don't know. So
So I tell you, man.
how can we make it better? Or like yeah, just how can we make it better?
And so we can't make that mob better. I think a better question is, what else should we be doing?
Yeah, yeah.
And so, and it reminds me of what Scott Epsley said, and I think who was actually on your pocket, right? So Scott, he actually was one of the people that commented on the post, and he agreed. And what he said was that, you know, he said that he did a study, and he said, "Hey, look, NBA players do not use their full range of dorsiflexion during movements. So let's just say if an athlete has 26 degrees of dorsiflexion, when they're going through their movements, they're not using all of their motion, right?" Subsequently he said that therefore the time you spend trying to mold that talar crural joint could be better spent on other joints. Okay, so what other joints should you be spending your time on? Right, where we know that we're trying to mobilize the talus, and if we know the talus is actually all at once or simultaneously rather a part of, yes, the talocrural joint, but it's also part of the subtalar joint. It's also part of the talocalcaneonavicular joint. It's also part of the transverse tarsal joint. So what can we do more distal to the talus? What can we do to the calcaneus? What can we do to navicular? What can we do to the first metatarsal? What can we do to the cuboid or the calcaneocuboid joint? What can we do to those other neighboring joints? Because all of those joints couple together simultaneously, right? They don't get to just move independently of another. If you don't have a calcaneal cuboid joint that is moving correctly, you won't have a talocrural joint that's moving correctly, and vice versa. And I think just getting people to realize that you can't, the talocrural joint just doesn't just get to be on its own island, right? The talus is still part of that navicular capsule. It's still part of that calcaneal capsule. So you kind of have to evaluate and treat, everything in the foot, the midfoot, the forefoot, and further up the chain in the knee. It's not just about pushing that thing backwards and trying to get some dorsiflexion. Actually, I forgot. So, this goes back to answer your question about what was my thought process. I started thinking about closed chain dorsiflexion, right? And you've done the weight bearing closed chain dorsiflexion test, like the needle wall test, right? And we call that like an ankle dorsiflexion test. Well, if your foot is on the ground, and you're moving your tibia, where's my guy? Where's my friend? Hold on. Here we go. Here's my friend. All right. And so, let's just say this is the person's knee. Yeah, we're in here. And you're trying to look at their closed chain dorsiflexion. If the foot is supported on the ground and you move into closed chain dorsiflexion, you're moving into pronation of the foot, right? So you can't separate closed chain ankle dorsiflexion from pronation. So if your foot can't pronate, then your ankle can't dorsiflex, and vice versa. And then you have to look at all of the things that make up proper pronation of the foot, which is everything, which is every bone, every joint in the foot. And so when I started to think about it, I said, oh, wait, you can't separate ankle dorsiflexion from foot pronation. Wait, you can't separate knee flexion from ankle dorsiflexion. You can't separate hip flexion from foot. Like, so then I started thinking about, oh wow, everything is so heavily coupled. And when we start thinking about trying to make changes at these critical joints like the ankle, we have to use a more holistic approach, and we have to truly, it starts with just knowing more about the anatomy and the biomechanics of, all of the neighboring joints.
So, uh, since we can't only do the sagittal plane
Yeah.
mobilization, uh, is it better to do like you mentioned, closed chain ankle dorsiflexion, some sort of like Gary Gray stuff? Is that going to be better for like if we want to improve ankle dorsiflexion?
And so here's the issue: you have to figure out a way to constrain movement. Because if you just do Gary Gray style and put the person up on a incline slant board and have them doing some close chain dorsiflexion with different drivers and different directions, and you got the trunk and the hip and the pelvis driving in all these directions, that will get you something. But if you haven't constrained movement at the ankle or the foot, you may not be driving stress where you need it. And you may just be attenuating structures that your body can already attenuate. And how helpful is that in the long term? You may get more movement other places, the hip, the spine, the pelvis, whatever. But you have to figure out a way to constrain the foot. And the best way I found to actually constrain the foot is using implements. And so I'm always using an implement. If you watch me treat, I'm always using some type of foot wedge, whether it be some type of wedge, whether it be a blackboard, whether it be a rolled up towel, whether it be any other my miscellaneous foot devices, whether it be a band. I'm always trying to constrain motion at the foot and the tibia at the same time to drive stress exactly where I've decided I want to drive stress per my eval. And so a lot of times, if if you need more dorsiflexion in the ankle, you probably also need more dorsiflexion in your midfoot.
Yeah.
And so, what compromises good dorsiflexion of a midfoot, right? On this medial column, let me turn that around. On this medial column, right? You're going to need um, good plantar flexion of this cuboid and navicular on this first metatarsal um, to drive or to set up more ankle dorsiflexion. And a lot of times, we know NBA players, we know basketball players have reduced toe dorsiflexion, but they also have reduced midfoot dorsiflexion. And a lot of that has to do with the morphological changes over time due to footwear, stress of the game, improper recovery strategies. Um, and we know from that study that just came out that the NBA funded using, I think it was the Maine Red Claws and a couple other D1 basketball schools that, they found that, and this is with a mean age of 21, where the talonavicular joint of 30% of the athletes that they evaluated were sclerotic or degenerative, right? Which that basically just means that the space that was once available in this talonavicular joint has now been cut or reduced, right? Um, and the talonavicular joint is the extension or the modulator of the medial column, right? And it's the midfoot version or the midfoot modulator of the medial column of the forefoot. And so if you don't if you don't get good movement through this talonavicular joint, you will never get good dorsiflexion through your midfoot. And so if you're chronically losing dorsiflexion in your midfoot due to actual morphological changes, not just something you can mob away, not just something you can dry needle away, right? This is an actual morphological change that probably cannot be reversed. Well, it can't be reversed. Then that is that's one of the reasons why it's difficult to mob the talocrural joint and expect a change, right? Because if the foot hits the ground reaction force is going to go through the foot and it's going to demand motion in the foot first.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if you don't have the capability to move through the foot to attenuate force, you're going to have that reduced. You're going to have increased forces up the chain, right, up to the knee, right, which we see a lot of patellofemoral issues in basketball players, and you won't get the coupling mechanics to have your safe, smooth relative dorsiflexion in the talocrural joint.
So that led me to my other question is that why are there so many like lower limb injury right now in the
Mm,
league? And like we talked before, a lot of, and also like I think Coach Fu also said the same thing about this, is that a lot of it came from the foot.
yeah,
So, uh, and also like we mentioned, like doing purely sagittal
that doesn't exist.
isometric
That
or
doesn't
like
exist. There is no pure sagittal movement.
wait, wait, wait,
I'm gonna
wait,
let you finish though.
wait, yeah,
I
yeah.
got you. I know what you
I
mean
know,
though.
I know. Bill
Yeah,
Harmon's gonna say
I know.
Bill Harmon's gonna say it's a dirty word, but wait,
Yes, that is a dirty word.
wait. So, yeah, probably sagittal plane is not. All right, for tendinopathy or
Yeah.
tendinosis,
Okay.
doing only like tempo eccentric or isometric probably doesn't work. So can you kind of share your thought on
Mm.
like these lower limb injury or like tendinopathy?
Man. Well, whew, where do I start? Lower limb injuries. All
How
right.
about we start by why why is satchel playing dirty work?
Okay. So we don't have to even get into the whole because that is kind of boring to talk about, and people aren't interested in that. Let's talk about the first thing you did mention: the eccentrics, the tempo isometrics, the heavy slows for tendons, right? Um, and we can kind of move into pathomechanics of explanations of injuries in the NBA, lower limb injuries in the NBA. And I'll say, if you look at something coming from mainstream traditional PT research of how do you treat a tendon, how do you treat, let's say, the Achilles tendon, what are the protocols, right? One of the big protocols is like an Alfredson's protocol, right? With the two up, one down, right? And if it's insertional, then you don't just go as low, and just to reduce the compression that excessive dorsiflexion will cause at the insertion of the Achilles. And if it's non-insertional or it's mid portion, go as low as you can and try to maybe focus on hitting top ranges in the calf raise, right? And when people have an Achilles tendon, I guess, tendinopathy or any issue, it's like, all right, well, let's load the tendon, right? But it's like, well, how did we get to this point though? Right? Because there's been several times where a guy comes in with patellar tendinopathy or pain in his tendon or pain in their Achilles, and I do nothing to the Achilles, and they get off the table and then no longer have pain. Well, how do you explain that? I didn't do a heavy slow. I didn't do an isometric for analgesic, right? Now, obviously, I have the benefit of having manual therapy skills that many strength coaches either don't have or not even supposed to have. They're strength coaches. Um, but if you look at something like an Alfredson's protocol or heavy slow for an Achilles tendinopathy, and here's the issue, it kind of just goes back to everything that we talked about with the posterior talar mode. Why is the Achilles tendon experiencing a pain phenomenon? Right? There has to be an overload issue. Why is the Achilles experiencing an overload issue? Well, let's look at what the Achilles tendon is, I guess, tasked with, right? Let's look at during early stages of gait, right? It's trying to store some energy. Let's just be really simple. During late stages of gait, it's trying to produce power, put force into the ground, and propulse you via its connection to the triceps or the calf, right? And through plantar flexion power. And so one of the things, as my phone pops up as 20% left. But one of the things that I like to think about is you have primary movers and primary certain tissues have primary responsibilities, but there are synergists and there are helpers, right? So what's a synergist of a calf? What would you just say? Hey, what is what other muscles do plantar flexion outside of the calf? That's a question. So I'll tell you, right? It's your other extrinsic foot muscles, right? Some of them are dorsiflexors, some of them are also plantar flexors. And what you'll have is, say, like a muscle like posterior tib, right? It's a plantar flexor.
Yep.
And so by virtue of it being a plantar flexor or flexor hallucis longus, which is a freakishly huge muscle. If you ever dissect a human and look at the lower limb and you look at the posterior lower limb, the flexor hallucis longus, even though it's the big toe muscle, it's huge, it's thick. And it was surprising how thick that muscle was in terms of its muscle belly. And those are all synergists to, or flexor digitorum longus. Those are all synergists to the calf and the Achilles. So anything or any pathology that has compromised the posterior tib, flexor digitorum longus, flexor hallucis longus, has now reduced its ability to be a helpful partner with the Achilles in producing power and the I guess, cost effectiveness of movement or energetics is what we'll call that. And so, this just like anything else. If me and you go do a job and we got to go move, we got to go help somebody move, right? It's hard enough to help somebody move. You're moving all these boxes, right? How much harder would it be if halfway through the job, I get on a phone call, like, hey, just give me 1 second. I just got a quick phone call, right? It's like 2 minutes, 2 minutes. And then you look over, you're still moving boxes though. It's 10 minutes goes by. Hold on 1 second. I got one more second, right? You're still moving boxes. 20 minutes, I'm still on the phone, right? Now a two-man job just turned into a one-man job. And you think about how you're going to feel at the end of that day. And I finally got off the phone. I get back to moving boxes. Hey, man. And we finished the job. I'm like, hey, that wasn't so bad. And you're like, who are you talking to? Like, it was bad, right? Because you took a break. And that's kind of analogous to the synergist of certain movement patterns in certain positions, or during propulsion or locomotion or gait, whatever you want to say. It doesn't have to be gait. It could just be locomotion. We could talk about a step back or a snatch back or a side step or a deceleration, right? There are synergists to all of our primary movers. So we can't just focus on the calf, right? When the calf or the Achilles is heavily reliant on its synergistic relationships with the post tib, the flexor digitorum longus, flexor hallucis longus. So, what type of foot presentations or pathologies would affect the force production ability of those three muscles? Well, let's say we have hallux valgus, right? If we have hallux valgus, is the flexor hallucis longus in a position to produce force at its most efficient rate?
No.
Nah, right? Or let's say if we have hammer toes, right? Which pretty much every NBA team does, right? We got these hammer toes, right? Is the flexor digitorum longus now an ability to produce the force that it's supposed to, that it usually would produce, right? To help in propulsion and resupination and stiffening the foot for propulsion? No, right? So that's kind of what pathomechanics is. And that's why I call myself a pathomechanist now. It's because it's important to look at all of the relationships in how studying the material sciences of these tissues and how morphological changes affect certain muscles, how a certain muscle may have secondary roles, and how when those secondary roles are no longer being able to be fulfilled, how that affects other tissues like our prime movers. And then all of a sudden somebody walks into your weight room or to your treatment room and they say, hey man, my Achilles is sore. And then you just do some calf raises but they're heavy and slow. And you don't really treat or look at anything else. That's kind of, that goes to whether it's a patella tendon or Achilles tendon or any tendon. We have to look at everything involved and figure out ways truly to prevent them. But once we get ourselves in these situations, we got to figure out ways to kind of treat everything simultaneously to kind of, if there's 5 reasons why the Achilles tendon is flamed up, trying to work on removing each one of those 5 things holistically outside of just loading the tendon.
Yeah,
If
that's
that's was that kind of helpful? Was that
yeah, yeah, sure, sure.
all right?
Right. So that's for tendinopathy and iso or like slow eccentric. What about like all those like lower limb injury in the league?
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of the same, Um, most of the injuries are foot and ankle. I remember when I was watching the playoffs last year, and how many calf strains actually changed the dynamics of the playoffs, right? And you know, if a couple calf strains don't happen, maybe there's a different champion last year, right? Um, and we're looking at so many foot and ankle injuries over and over. Of course, the king is still the lateral ankle sprain, followed probably by the calf strain. But we even had a rise of Achilles ruptures this year. I think we're up to, unfortunately, 4 Achilles ruptures this year. And, I talk about this a little bit in my e-guide or my ebook about how, we've always thought that the Achilles rupture was a old man injury, like an old man's injury. But you got 21-year-olds rupturing their Achilles now in the league, 22-year-olds, 23-year-olds. rupturing their Achilles. And so, what's our explanation for that? And so I don't have the world's greatest explanation to, why every specific, you know, injury happens, but I do know that we do need pathomechanical theory, right? That looks at everything, to start addressing some of our interventions. So if we talk about some of the morphological changes to the talonavicular joint, something as simple as, hey, look, you need to know more about the talonavicular joint, right? Because if your practitioners don't care or wouldn't think to go even assess the talonavicular joint, right? How can they treat it? How can they, intervene or in a more prophylactic way so that we don't have these reoccurring injuries? Because one thing is for sure, the most predicted, the best predictor of injury is a past injury. So if we can prevent any kind of injury, that's going to help, especially with the catastrophic ones. But once we start getting these recurring injuries and you have players that are, the players, we all know the players that are in the NBA that, sprain their ankle every year or sprain it twice a year. And how some of those players it holds their careers back. Even as we know the famous case of Steph Curry, that kind of held him back a little bit, just due to the fact that he just couldn't be on the court. And when he finally figured out, and I guess shout out to Golden State for getting a handle on that, and to get him a couple of years of ankle sprain free, and the rest is history. So I think the lower extremity injuries, it's a lot of overuse injuries going chronic, a lot of chronic injuries in impacting or causing morphological changes to the tissues involved. Those morphological changes changing biomechanics of the joints and of the motor patterns, and bad footwear, and maybe some lack of understanding on our behalf of foot and ankle mechanics, and that kind of whole perfect storm of circumstances is probably why we're seeing still a rise in these injuries. And and it's not on the NBA practitioner. It's not, they're not the sole cause or the sole responsible person for these injuries, because the process for these morphological changes starts at probably age 14, especially for the high performing basketball athlete. If this kid ends up making it to the NBA, he was a high performer when he was 14. He probably was 6'4", jumping out of the gym when he was 14 years old, playing 4 AAU games a day, right? Wearing shoes super tight with 2 socks on, right? Trying to squeeze their foot so they don't feel any slide of the foot in the shoe, so they can feel explosive and powerful, and wearing their shoes all day, right? And then wearing flip-flops after they play their games, and then they're grabbing and gripping the ground with their flip-flops for 10 straight years. And then now you have a 22-year-old in the NBA who hasn't been treated until now, right? He went 6 years of playing AAU ball from age 12 to age 18 of no treatment, no good training, right? He was worthy of good treatment and needed good treatment when he was 17, but he didn't get it. All right. And he doesn't get any good treatment until he's 19. And then now you get a top tier NBA player when he's 20, if he goes, one and done. And now it's on us to reverse 7, 8, 9, 10 years of morphological changes, right? Because we saw the study, it's 30% of those players had degenerative and sclerotic talonavicular joints by the age of 21. That doesn't happen overnight. That's a process.
Wait, so before I ask you the next question,
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna ask you this because Adam always said this. The pathomechanism, this word, he said, you invented this word. He always said to me that you invented this word. I'm like, what the?
A pathomechanism. Now, did I invent the word pathomechanism? I don't think I invented that word. Did I decide to step out and lead the charge and change my LinkedIn bio to pathomechanist? Yes. Um, and literally, it's not me being a genius or anything. It's because I'm like, okay, the study of biomechanics. That person is called a biomechanist. The study of pathomechanics. I'm gonna call myself a pathomechanist, and just see what happens. I don't know. Let's just see how this goes. Um, but I was inspired by Andy Horwood, probably one of the greatest biomechanists in the world currently. He's a podiatrist out of Ireland. He's taking me under his wing. He's an OG, and I can't take credit for all the stuff that I've been able to do if it wasn't for his constant tutelage. To have somebody that has been studying biomechanics in the foot for 50 years and to care enough to call me, get on Zoom calls, answer my question, send me materials, vet my processes, vet my LinkedIn posts before I post them. Um, you know, um, so yeah, a pathomechanist. I didn't invent that word because it's just literally me, path. But here's the thing: pathomechanics is slept on, and it is something that is not referenced enough. People, when they talk about their explanations for injuries, they're talking about pathomechanics, and they just don't know it. It has a word, and I think we need to address that and put a word to it that um and we need more people thinking about pathomechanics. And I think that people have even misconstrued what biomechanics means, because most people think that biomechanics is like force plates and 3D motion capture.
No.
And that's not biomechanics, right? The study of tissue material properties is more biomechanics than 3D
Yeah,
marker
for
motion
sure, for
capture.
sure, for
Like,
sure.
that's pure biomechanics,
Yeah.
right? It's almost pure physics, right? Tissue stress theory, stress strain, um, the the makeup of why collagen can resist force, why a meniscus can resist force due to its biological materials and what it's made out of, and the Young's modulus, and viscoelasticity and hysteresis loops and all these things. That's biomechanics on the micro. And those are the first principles, the foundations, and from that you get your force plates, and you get your 3D motion capture, and you get you know your people who talk about IR and ER and compression, and and calling that biomechanics, which is more like clinical biomechanics. It's more clinical orthopedics mixed with biomechanics. So I guess in a roundabout way, yeah, I am leading the charge, calling myself, I'm the best pathomechanics in the world because I'm the only one. So
Okay, okay, that's good. That's like really good. Okay, all right. So before I ask you a question about like 3D motion capture we kind of talked about yesterday,
hmm,
I want to talk about like lower limb biomechanics or like how human body moves
hmm.
and why earlier on in our conversation we said like uh sagittal plane is a dirty word.
Yeah. Well, if you read the ebook or the e-guide, whatever you want to call it, it's short. So I don't want to act like I done wrote a whole novel. All right, y'all. It's short. It's 15 pages, but read it, honestly. And then message me on LinkedIn and ask some questions, or just hop on a phone call with me. Um, but let's just quickly talk about, I think, the two most important things to address when we're talking about lower limb mechanics or biomechanics, and you're talking about sagittal plane versus transverse plane. And is saying sagittal plane a dirty word? It is, because nothing can happen in the sagittal plane, right? Purely, if something happens, you know what, it can. And those are your people that ends up getting surgeries. If
Yeah,
you're moving, right? So if you move purely in the sagittal plane, you're tearing your meniscus. That's why you tore your
yeah,
meniscus,
yeah,
right? Because you do move primarily in the sagittal plane, and now you don't have the proper um, innate biomechanical movement or arthrokinematic motion in your joint that allows dispersion of motion. It allows, I don't want to go there. I was going to talk about hydrodynamics of fluid mechanics in a joint. We
Let's
don't have to
get
go there.
wherever you
We don't
want.
have to go there. But all right, let me backtrack. The two things that I was going to say: conjunct rotation, and we're talking about foot and or we're talking about lower limb biomechanics, the mitered hinge theory, and that's in the ebook. And let's talk about conjunct rotation. You would see everybody's seen the Instagram posts that talk about with knee pain. If you got knee pain, try internally rotating your tibia as you move your knee forward, and then all your knee pain will be gone, right? You've seen posts like that where they're talking about introducing rotation in closed chain dorsiflexion or knee flexion, both at the same time, right? Will help to mitigate some of that stress, and that is correct-ish. But it definitely helps a lot more than just moving your knee with adding any rotation. And Gary Gray does stuff like that where he, you know, I forgot what he calls that manual reaction, having people go through a motion while you're
Yeah.
mobbing the motion. And that's a Gary Gray or movement with mobilization type of, theory. But the thing with that is, um, it the first principle of that is conjunct rotation. And it's just the innate rotation that happens in any osteokinematic joint motion, whether it be IR or ER. And it's the motion that allows forces to disperse. And it's also the motion that connects axial rotations of the tibia to axial rotations to the tibia in the vertical to longitudinal rotations of the foot in the frontal plane, right? So that's the mitered hinge theory where we drive a motion in the vertical axis and it drives motion in the frontal axis. Um, and conjunct rotations happens innately, right? So you don't need to think about doing knee cars of tibia rotations. That's not the conjunct rotation. The rotation happens during knee flexion, during knee extension, during hip extension, right? These are or knee valgus or knee varus, right? That's where the conjunct rotation is happening, and it's due to the structure of the joints, the obliquity of ligaments, and the obliquity of muscles, and the conical shape or cone shape of the interaction of how, like, we'll just say, for example, the femur, it's in a cone shape and it sits on top of the tibia. So when the knee starts to flex, the femur will move more on the lateral aspect. It'll roll more on the lateral aspect than it rolls on the medial aspect. And so what happens if you're rolling more on this side than this side? You end up rotating. And that's just what happens. It has to happen innately. It's non-volitional rotation. It's non-volitional control. It's for the same reason why when you're doing shoulder flexion, you'll have somebody have an impingement sign. Have you ever heard of like a shoulder impingement?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so you'll have this thing called an arc sign. And it's like, hey, you're good until you have to go here. Right. And it's because there's a conjunct rotation happening that the first part of this motion is ER bias. But once you get past 90 degrees, you start to internally rotate. And so that if you don't have internal rotation or if you don't have the ability to attenuate your posterior capsule, you're going to get an impingement sign or you're going to get some pain. But right when you move past it, it frees up. You don't feel any pain. And so that is a sign of conjunct rotation, that it's this non-volitional motion in osteokinematic motion, that shoulder flexion, a sagittal plane motion, right, goes through biases of IR and ER. And this is me trying to put it as simple as possible.
Bro, you gotta think. Not everybody know that you have an ebook. So I'm gonna need you to dumb it down a little bit for those who haven't read the ebook or
Yeah.
those who so for those that this is the first time of them like first time in their life that hearing that there's no pure sagittal plane movement. Can you just explain to me like what happens
Okay,
when we do what happens in the knee, just in the knee.
I
Keep
got you.
keep it
Okay,
basic. What happens when we do triple flexion? What happens
perfect.
when we do triple extension?
Let's talk
Let's
about a
keep it simple.
squat.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, so squat right now. All right, so not you. All right, you're doing a body weight squat. As you go down into this body weight squat, you're moving in the sagittal plane, right? If we're talking super basic. Here, as you're squatting, you're getting to the bottom of your squat. As you're squatting, yes, this bone is moving forward. Sagittal plane is moving forward. But now I want you to just add one more motion on top of it. It's going to move forward, but it's going to spin while it goes forward. So imagine that this bone is spinning either to the left or to the right while it moves forward. And it has to, and it will on a very small level, right? On a very small level. As this bone moves forward, it's also spinning either to the left or to the right, and we would call that IR or ER. And so as this bone moves forward, this bone is also going to internally rotate because we talked about, or we didn't really talk about, but pronation is analogous to internal rotation. Supination is analogous to external rotation. If we're talking like simple,
Yeah.
like the most simple standpoint. And a lot of the times when you're running into issue, if you see somebody squat, now let's take this for example, somebody squatting and then their knee is caving in, right? What's happening? What probably happened is your knee was going forward and then it had to move inward because it was supposed to be spinning and moving forward. And for some reason, it couldn't spin anymore. So instead of spinning and moving forward in a straight line, it decided to move out to figure out a way to continue to get more of that spin. So a lot of times, one of the reasons why we run into pain or we have aberrant movement patterns is just due to a lack of that rotation in the joint. So that if that is simple, I don't know, but just think about a bone moves forward, and then now add a bone spins either internally or externally as it moves forward or back.
Nice, nice. That's perfect. That's
Yeah.
perfect. I know that's like super basic, but
Yeah.
let's keep it simple this time. We can like dive deeper next time. So, uh, after like the basic of how the after the basic like biomechanics or the mechanics of lower limb, how they move. I guess my last question is, so since you see so many foot and we talk about foot and ankle, all these stuff, like how would you assess a foot when an athlete comes to you?
Me? Oh, well, I have a whole process. Um, it starts by I get them standing. I kind of just look at them. I want to see. I look at them from posterior view, anterior view, side view, um, and then I kind of look at okay, where is you can do something as simple as checking left to right. Okay, what do I see with the medial column? Is one foot flatter than the other? All right, that's one check. Is one foot turned out more than the other? That's another check. Um, is one is one calcaneus rotated or supinated more than another or everted more than another. Um, is one tibia um, or is one talus bulging out, and you can see that kind of like where you look at the inside of somebody's ankle, and it just looks like kind of like almost like somebody, almost like something's trying to come out of the skin like that. It's kind of like poking out, and it's attenuating more of the medial deltoid ligament and spring ligament, um, which is something you always see kind of coupled with like a flat foot, that is a medial arch in supporting structures that has maybe collapsed or failed over time. And I'm looking at all those things in standing. I'm also looking at whether I see maybe the hip maybe turned a certain way. Um, that can be something simple. Just kind of looking, just kind of like getting like a running hypothesis of what I expect to see when I eval their foot. So then I may get them on the table, and then I go through a process where look at their, I'll look at their, it depends. Sometimes I look at some people's knees first. I may look at somebody's hip first, but I'll check IR, ER of the hip. I'll check IR, ER of the knee, tibial rotation. And then I'll go check at the foot. I have a whole process where I'm looking at the coupling relationships of the calcaneus on the knee, on the hip. So if I evert the calcaneus, not only am I checking how much range of motion does the calcaneus evert, but I'm also looking at when I do evert the calcaneus, what happens to the knee, what happens to the hip. And that is money. That is where your money is, because it's not about just looking at the calcaneus in a silo. It's about when it does move, does it have the freedom to move purely in its physiologic motion that it's supposed to have? Or when it moves, does it have to make everything else move with it? And I'm always looking at those coupling relationships. And so I'll look at maybe calcaneal motion on midfoot motion. I'll stabilize midfoot, move the calcaneus, look up the chain. I'll do the same thing, stabilize the calcaneus, move the midfoot, or maybe I'll rotate it. Hopefully this maybe can help. I'll stabilize the calcaneus, and then I'll just, um, this isn't helpful. I don't know if this is helpful.
No, it's good. It's good. It's good. It's good.
uh, but I'll rotate the midfoot this way and this way, try my best, but I'll try to stabilize the calcaneus, right? So I'm grabbing here, rotating here, looking up the chain. And then I'll maybe check, have a couple of my own tests that is hard to explain, um, but they check that mitered hinge theory, which I didn't really end up ever explaining, but it's basically something that people came up with maybe like in the 60s. It talked about for every degree of internal rotation of the tibia, there's going to be an analogous or simultaneous degree of rotation in this plane. So if you rotate the tibia 5 degrees this way, in internal rotation, you should see 5 degrees of rotation in the foot. That's the mitered hinge theory. Um, it's very flawed. It's very wrong. It's not very wrong, but it's very flawed. But it's a helpful framework to get people to go, oh, that's a thing, that the tibia rotates this way and makes the foot rotate that way. Okay, that's a good starting point.
Okay.
But I'm looking at the talus relationship. Okay, can the talus resupinate? Then I'm looking at the columns of the foot. So you can separate the foot, hind foot, midfoot, forefoot, but then you also can separate the forefoot in medial and lateral columns. So then I'm looking at the joint play of the medial and the lateral columns, looking at that relationship, and then while I'm looking at that relationship, I'm looking up the chain and seeing what's happening. So I'm kind of going through this whole process of checking the hind foot, checking the midfoot, checking the forefoot, separating forefoot, medial, lateral, looking up the chain with every single one of those things, and then comparing left to right, to put it simply.
Nice. 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 I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
All right. So last thing before I let it go,
All right.
but I don't want you to dive super deep into this. I just want very simple thought process. and I want to like keep it the next time so we can dive into it next time. So when they standing, like I'm a huge Bill Hartman fan right now, so
Okay.
you know what I'm gonna ask? Like, do you look at is it like are they in late proposal? Are they mid-stance or are they
Yep.
is that a thing
Yep.
you're gonna consider? Just that, just that.
Is that a thing I'm going to consider? I think that the things that I do look at are actually analogous to what he's already saying. So if a foot is stuck, if a foot can't pronate, then I'm saying that it's supinated. Which, okay, what representation is a supinated foot? That's a late, that's a late stage, um, propulsive type of foot that doesn't change shape and modulate and pronate. So, do I typically use that verbiage of late P, early P, mid P? No. Um, but I do know that early, um, I do know that what's supposed to happen, right? So, I do know that if a calcaneus cannot plantar flex, right, like at heel strike, calcaneus needs to plantar flex, evert, amongst other things, AB duct relative to the talus, um, then they don't have a good chance of setting up mid stance. So I look at the things that whatever happens first affects the last things dramatically. So if your heel hits the ground and everything sucks from that point on, when you leave the ground, it's going to suck, right? It's a chain of events. It's a sequence of events, right? Um, and it's supposed to be like that so that you can mitigate force, store force, um, develop stiffness, um, develop free stiffness through tendons, ligaments, right, and muscles, uh, and propulse. And then you develop that stiffness, and then you propulse, and you use your free energy and your plantar flexor power, hip extension power, in combination, and then you do it all over again. So it's a sequence, and so I know that if a foot can't pronate, then it definitely can't propulse properly. And I know that the way it's going to propulse is probably not beneficial for its sustainability long term. It may be good for performance. It may make you may be super fast, you may be super stiff off the ground, you may have a great RSI. Like all our NBA guys are really quick off the ground, they get up high off the ground, but it's not sustainable uh, long term for health. And that's kind of why Bill Hartman talks about those presentations of foot on a spectrum of health continuum and performance continuum. So I look at it, I look at it, I look at it for more of what is this specific joint doing? What is this specific joint doing? Because if I just change it, then I changed it, and good stuff is going to happen. But as a framework, it may be helpful for people to think about early, mid, late. Um, but don't forget about swing phase too. A lot of good stuff happens in swing phase where to try to not to go crazy, you have the reverse windlass mechanism. So we know about the windlass mechanism at the end of propulsion when you dorsiflex the toes and the plantar fascia and all that good stuff, right? But if you don't have active dorsiflexion while your foot is in swing before it hits the ground, right, then you don't have the ability to set up the best way to store energy. So your dorsiflexors are, especially extensor digitorum longus, it's dorsiflexing your toes before you hit the ground, so that when you do hit the ground, you can plantar flex out of that dorsiflexion and then start storing more energy. So if you start in a more plantar flex position when you first hit, then it's downhill from there. So everything matters. Swing phase matters, whether you want to call it, early, late stance, all these different presentations. I think it is helpful if you can grasp his concepts. It is helpful to have a framework. Frameworks are always helpful. And if you want to liken it to gait, that's cool. But just remember that's forward locomotion. And that's not the same in terms of um, lateral locomotion, or doing a spin move, or doing a snatch back or a step back. Um, because, and it depends on, are we talking about gait, like walking gait, or running gait, a heel strike or a forefoot strike? So, you have all those different things. And that's why I stick to memorizing, understanding the actual joint mechanics no matter what, no matter whether it's from reverse, no matter you're moving backwards, forwards, or sideways. I know if the forefoot hits first, I know what's happening, and I know the coupling mechanisms that's going to continue to happen up the chain. If the heel hits first, I know what's going to happen next, and I know the coupling mechanics is going to happen up the chain. And I think just knowing those, um, rather than a framework, and this is not me hating on the amazing model, the model of Bill Hartman. I just think that first principles matters most, and you got to learn your joints. You got to learn the arthrokinematics. You got to learn the muscle mechanics outside of their traditional textbook ways, um, the textbook um, definitions of what these muscles do, and you got to know what is possible in so many different variations of how muscles and joints work first, and then your framework kind of supports that knowledge. But I think the first principles is knowing what joints are moving, knowing the coupling mechanisms of the joints, and how um, those coupling relationships continue to transfer up the chain.
Perfect, perfect. That's perfect. So I guess this is all the question I have for you today. So for those who are interested in what we're talking about today,
Yeah.
and for those who are interested in the foot ankle, where can they find the ebook and where can they find those like really good posts?
Yeah, well, I'm not a big IG guy, but you can follow me on Terris Hightower. Um, I may go on a rant about the state of performance and strength and conditioning on my stories if you want to mute me for those sometimes. My LinkedIn is where I keep it professional, and I do all my beautiful, really hardworking posts where I try to fill in gaps for people and produce really thought-provoking, rethinking, traditional type of performance practices or interventions or thoughts. So my LinkedIn is where you'll see a lot of my posts. And if you need the ebook or you want the ebook, I don't have it like easily to access, but you can DM me. Um, if you look at my latest post on LinkedIn, you can drop the word frustrum in the comments on that post, and I will DM you the ebook. Or hit me up. You can email me at terrisdhightower@gmail. I think that's about it. That's all I really got. Can you hear me?
Nice, nice.
Okay.